we call it 11 steps, not 10, but 11 steps for making a good policy pitch. And this, in many respects, can be a policy pitch that you'd be making in person. But also, I think the lessons apply when you're writing up the policy memo. And in fact, the two are connected, right? Much of what you're trying to do is a policy pitch that is convincing enough that they say, give me that one pager, right? So you go from making the pitch in person to writing it. And so these lessons are derived from my time primarily working in Washington, D.C. for 20 plus years, kind of at the interface between science and policy, applied research and practitioners and decision makers. And that was done primarily at a place called the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, a nonpartisan, non-advocacy institution trying to bring these worlds together. There I was fortunate to work for and learn from former Congressman Lee Hamilton, who was a distinguished member of Congress, went on to do things like the 9/11 Commission and the Rock Study Group, and someone who taught me a lot about how to do this kind of pitching and in some ways lessons for what not to do. And then did a lot of external ones. If that was an internal one to the Wilson Center, external ones that were, pitching people I'd be working with on a daily basis, pitching mid-level bureaucrats in government, State Department, Defense Department, Environmental Protection Agency, pitching funders. These are skills that are really important for getting and keeping funding. And then sometimes, on occasion, really senior practitioners, policymakers, and decision makers. And so the ones that I've been lucky to do have ranged from UN Secretary General Kofi Annan to a couple senators and Melinda Gates from the Gates Foundation and such. So it's from that kind of very elite down to the everyday conversations that hopefully these lessons will be helpful. So let's start with, if they're 11, the first one is you got to start with tailoring your pitch by knowing exactly who you're pitching to. You need to ask yourself that question first. You need to ask, what do they know? What can you reasonably expect for them to know, right? Because you don't want to tell them a bunch of things they already know. They'll get impatient and cut you off. What are their responsibilities and their capabilities? What are their interests? What budgets do they have at their access? What means of influence do they have, right? So you want to really think about what you're pitching them, how you're pitching it, by who they are. So it really requires what we call a kind of walking in other shoes, really knowing who you're pitching. A second, to get their attention, is to say, what is the threat or what is the opportunity that you're asking them to address, right? You want to get their attention because it's something that could happen or is happening that's bad, that they don't want to have happen, or that there's this fantastic opportunity for them to make a difference, to accomplish some of their goals, to work towards their objectives. And so it can be setting out those stakes up front. They can be negative or they can be positive stakes, but it gets their attention. And it also, in part, tells them why, if it's an ongoing topic, why there's something new or the conditions have changed, so that they actually have to pay attention to it now, whereas before they didn't think they had to. And in fact, as opposed to, in many instances, we're taught to kind of save that bottom line, the kicker, the punchline to the end. You want to tell them in a quick summary of what's the recommendation you're making. What is it that you want them to do? In journalism, we say, don't bury the lead, right? You don't save that critical point until the end, because you may not get to the end. It's a conversation, not something that they're obliged to listen to all the way through. So it is really about a quick summary. In some ways, think of it, we write abstracts at the top of an article. You want to be able, in a few sentences, to tell them where you're going to end up. Another kind of way to think about this is tell them what you're going to say it, and then at the end to tell them what you just said, right? So you keep reiterating the key point. So that's number 3, quick summary of the recommendation that you're making. Fourth one, And this seems simple, but can sometimes trip us up, which is you need to set a context, provide some key facts of what they need to know to understand the situation. This is where, in some ways, we're ill-served by the kind of the lessons we've learned in terms of writing a long research paper, right? You kind of introduce a topic and then you go on a long bender about the history, and you're demonstrating to your professor that you've really researched this and know this in detail. You do not want to do this in your policy pitch, whether you're saying it or writing it. You want to be prepared to provide those details. You would love for them to ask you more about it so that you can demonstrate that you really understand the topic, the context, the key data points, the trends. Those are things that you want them to ask more about, but you don't want to bog them down because very quickly they'll grow impatient. You have to, it really, this can be a 15, 30-second conversation. You want them to keep asking for more, so you have to be ready. But giving just a couple key points. And that's, again, back to why it's important to think about what they know and what they don't know. So you can be comprehensive. It can be very effective to have a data point or some data, a trend, sometimes an anecdote. Oftentimes decision makers want the data eventually, but if you can give an example that is in some ways helps them understand what you're talking about and making what can be obtuse or at least complex, we'll say, policy questions. If you can bring that down to a story, we as humans understand a lot of these things as stories, then that's critical context to keep them in the right framework of what you're talking about. So that's number 4, context and key facts quickly. Number 5, what has been tried or what's going on now and why that isn't good enough. So this is back to the, why do I have to pay attention to this now? It can be, could be that what has been tried to date was a good approach, but there aren't resources to bring it to scale or to keep up. It could be that the approaches that have been tried have been terrible and haven't worked at all. And in fact, that's why you're coming to make a pitch, because of policy failure. And the people have tried to tackle these problems, and they're not doing it well. Or it's important to remember that it can be the case that just no one's paying attention, no one's trying. And so it is, that can be a great opportunity. If you're pitching an opportunity, listen, this space is clear. There aren't real players, real actors trying to achieve the outcome that you're looking for, and that you're presenting this opportunity with a clear playing field that you can come in and make a difference. But so it can at times be that there isn't a lot that's being tried. And sometimes they're trying, it's poor, and sometimes they're trying, it's going well, but it's just not sufficient. That's number 5. What's been tried and why is what's going on now not good enough? Demands action. Number 6. This is the classic, you have a couple different possibilities. Many times people do not want to hear one way forward, your favorite way forward. They want to have choice. They want to be able to think about different options. So you give them options. And sometimes those are real and plausible and reasonable options. And so you can provide a couple ways forward. It may be that you split it up by time. So it's a phase 1 and phase 2. And you're asking them, makes it easier to say yes if you're asking them for an easy phase 1. But you do want to give them some sense of options. One possibility, of course, is to option 1, status quo, nothing changes. Of course, you're by definition not a fan of option 1 because you're saying we need to do something. We're missing a threat or we're missing an opportunity, but it is an option. It's status quo. We just keep doing what we're doing, and you've already said why that's not a great option. An option 2 could be, well, maybe call it a maximal option or solve all the problems, or something that's kind of maybe even positive if you could get there, but skips a lot of steps or assumes a lot of things go your way. And there too, it may be something you want to aspire to, but it's not necessarily a kind of a bite-sized piece for the practitioner or the policymaker to make that decision. So it's an option, it may be an ambition, but it's not a plan. It's not something that can be operationalized and broken into pieces. And then, of course, option 3 is your preferred option that you want them to land on. And again, this can be a couple possibilities by scale or by time. But that is a way to get to yes, to try to do the easy bits first. You get a process started, you have an opportunity for dialogue, opportunity to educate, to bring to bear more resources. What's the phrase? It's the camel's nose under the tent, right? First you get the nose and then hopefully get the whole camel eventually. So an incremental approach. So that's point number 6, having a couple of options, because people don't want to be told one option, yes or no. Number 7, you want to be honest, maybe to a point, but you want to be honest about what the downsides of what you're proposing are. What are the arguments against it? Ones that you might make, or ones certainly that opponents would make, so that, again, the person or persons you're pitching can feel like they are taking a critical view, they're anticipating arguments against it, against the step that you're proposing. It shows that you've considered those, right? A lot of times it's, well, what about, but what about? And you want to be able to say, yes, that's problematic. Here's why, here's how what I'm proposing addresses those problems. Or, yes, those are real challenges. However, the conditions are such that we have to kind of bear those costs because it's just so important that we move forward. So you do have to, in some ways, anticipate those questions, anticipate those criticisms, whether they come internally or externally, so that your decision maker can feel and think that you have really thought this through and have thought of the downsides. So that's number 7. What are the downsides of the arguments against the action that you're proposing? Number 8, connected to those downsides, who are the spoilers? Who is in a position, a person or an interest group or a fellow county commissioner or member of city council, or you name it, who are the folks who could create challenges for you? Again, part of it, anticipating the various possibilities that could result from the actions you're proposing to take. So who's going to lose? That could be financial, that could be prestige, that could be responsibility and portfolios, and who's going to be, who's going to be upset, and knowing that ahead of time. Now, this is where there's a balance. You certainly want to be prepared to answer that question. You may want to acknowledge that in the same way that you're acknowledging some of the downsides of the arguments against. Some folks aren't going to like this. One doesn't need to have a laundry list to show the legions of opponents that will line up against this decision. But nevertheless, you want to be ready for it. You want to acknowledge it, in part to just diffuse that question that you should get from a practitioner trying to understand all that's involved. So that's number 8. Who are the spoilers? Who's going to lose? Who's going to be upset? Number 9, what are the costs of inaction? So doing nothing is doing something. It's making a choice as well. And so this reiterates back to kind of what are the stakes up front, why now, but what are the costs of inaction? Inertia in the policy realm is a big opponent, always a challenge. And so there has to be some kind of cost or opportunity costs, missed opportunities for not taking steps. So that's number 9. Number 10, in some ways could come certainly earlier, but it's who else has or is working these problems? This is in part a way to show who may be allies. It's a way to show whom can we learn from, what lessons. It's providing an evidence base that this can be done, maybe not as well as it could be or at scale or resources. But it does get to a point that decision makers are often risk averse. And they're more likely to have a positive view and a more open mind, a willingness to go in the directions you're hoping they'll go, if they have more comfort that comes from seeing examples of others tackling these problems and tackling them successfully, or taking these steps. It's not necessarily a problem, but taking these steps and doing it in ways that show it can be done, successfully. It shows where you're getting your evidence of arguments against, but also why you think this is possible and worth doing. In that sense, they want company. they want to see that they're not the only ones doing it. As much as we as a society hold up champions who are pioneers, who doing something for a first time and such, we also need to remember that many times those who try to do something completely new or be the first to do it are not always successful. They often fail, and your practitioner is not going to want to do that. And so you want to anticipate the question, well, if this is such a great opportunity, why has no one else done it? And you want to give assurances that in a different state, a different county, in a different country, that these are things that can be tackled successfully. And so that can work in your favor. It also can be, in some ways, utilizing a sense of competition. Others are doing it. We should be too. We're being left behind. We can do it better. But in that sense too, it's having a survey and being able to provide who else is doing it and who's doing it better, number 10. And then finally, number 11, final one, which is that you summarize the case. You talk about the stakes, why it's a threat or an opportunity that needs to be acted upon now, why it is something that is doable, even in the face of opposition or challenges that you're prepared to describe, but you reiterate it. Oftentimes you're not going to get to that, right? You would have long been interrupted in a conversation before, but it's whether it's in a conversation or in a policy memo, you just don't want to end abruptly. Even if it's simply a sentence, it provides that kind of summary back to what the stakes are. Now in writing, this could be a couple pages maybe, or longer, but one has to think that often it is just the one page that somebody hopefully asks you for. So it's a lot to put in there. A lot of it is about thinking through what you write down in short form, but nevertheless, it's one where you hope to get that one page based on the conversation in a hallway or in a meeting or in the elevator and such when you're making your quick pitch. But I hope these 11 steps help you think through how you approach it, what you include, and anticipate in many ways some of the questions and pushback you might get, and set it up so that you're more likely to get a yes when making that policy pitch.